Imagine sitting in a tiny wooden cockpit, thousands of feet above the ground, wind screaming past your face, an enemy aircraft racing toward you at over 100 miles per hour. Your heart is pounding, your hands are shaking, and right in front of you, spinning at over 1,000 revolutions per minute, is your own propeller. And behind it, your machine gun. And the question that every single pilot in 1914 was asking themselves, the question that military engineers across 3 continents were losing sleep over, the question that would ultimately decide who controlled the skies and who fell burning from them, was this: how do you shoot a gun through a spinning propeller without blowing off your own blades? That question, that single terrifying engineering puzzle, changed the entire course of the First World War. It gave birth to the deadliest fighter pilots the world had ever seen. It sparked an arms race in the sky that would reshape aviation forever. And the answer, when it finally came, was so elegant, so beautifully mechanical, so absolutely diabolical in its simplicity that engineers on both sides of the war stared at it and wondered why on earth nobody had thought of it sooner. This is not just a story about a gun. This is a story about desperation, about genius, about men who strapped themselves into fragile machines held together with wire and canvas and flew into clouds of bullets because their countries told them to. This is the story of the synchronized gun, one of the most brilliant and deadly inventions in the history of human conflict, and the men who lived and died because of it. We're going to go all the way back to the very beginning, before the machine guns, before the propellers, before the dogfights. We're going back to a moment when the entire concept of war in the air was so new, so completely alien to every military commander alive, that nobody, not the generals, not the admirals, not the politicians, had the slightest idea what aircraft were actually supposed to do in a war. And that confusion, that complete lack of direction, is exactly where our story begins. The year is 1903. 2 brothers from Ohio have just proven that heavier-than-air powered flight is possible. Orville and Wilbur Wright have done something that centuries of dreamers, inventors, and engineers had failed to do. They have made a machine fly, and the world has gone absolutely mad with excitement. Within a decade, aircraft are everywhere. Air shows are drawing enormous crowds. Newspapers are publishing breathless accounts of altitude records and distance records and speed records. Aviation is the most exciting thing happening on the planet Earth, and everyone wants a piece of it. But the military? The military is not impressed. Not yet. The generals of Europe look at these flimsy contraptions, these things made of spruce wood and linen fabric and bicycle chains, and they see a toy, a curiosity, something for rich young men to kill themselves in on weekends. The idea that an airplane could be a weapon of war is, to most military commanders in 1910, 1911, 1912, almost laughable. Almost. Because there are a few people, a very small number of visionary officers scattered across the armies of Europe, who look at these flying machines and see something else entirely. They see eyes. They see the ability to fly above the battlefield and look down and see everything, where the enemy troops are massing, where their artillery is positioned, where their supply lines are moving. For thousands of years, armies have been essentially blind beyond the horizon. Now, for the first time in human history, a commander could send a man into the sky and actually see what was on the other side of that hill. And so, almost reluctantly, the great military powers of Europe began experimenting with aircraft. Not as weapons, not yet, as observation platforms, as flying scouts. The aircraft job in those early years was simple. Go up, look around, come back, and tell us what you saw. That was it. No guns, no bombs, just eyes in the sky. When the First World War erupts in August of 1914, both sides have these observation aircraft operating over the Western Front. And for a brief, almost peaceful moment in that otherwise horrific conflict, The pilots on opposite sides would sometimes wave at each other as they passed. They were all young men. They were all doing the same dangerous job. They were all, in some sense, in this together. That did not last long, because very quickly, the commanders on the ground realized something critical. These observation aircraft were changing the war. When you could see where the enemy's artillery was positioned, you could avoid it, or attack it, or call on fire on it. When you could see where enemy troops were massing for an attack, you could prepare your defenses. The observation aircraft were not just useful, they were becoming decisive. And that meant the other side's observation aircraft had to be stopped. And so the first aerial combats in history were not between sleek fighters armed with machine guns. They were between unarmed observers throwing things at each other. Literally, there are documented accounts of pilots throwing bricks at each other, throwing chains. One French pilot reportedly used a grappling hook, trying to snag the control cables of an enemy aircraft. It sounds almost comical until you remember that these men were thousands of feet in the air in aircraft that could barely sustain straight and level flight, trying to kill each other with construction equipment. Then the pistols came out. Pilots started flying with service revolvers and taking pot shots at enemy aircraft. The chances of actually hitting anything were almost zero, but the psychological effect was real. Then rifles. Then, inevitably, someone asked the obvious question: what if we put a machine gun on one of these things? And here's where the problem begins. Here is where that central engineering nightmare enters the picture. Because the machine gun as a weapon had been perfected in the late 1800s. The Maxim gun, the Vickers, the Lewis gun. These were devastating weapons, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. Put one on an aircraft, and you would have something genuinely terrifying. But where do you put it? That is the question. Where does the machine gun go? The first instinct is the obvious one. You put it at the front of the aircraft, pointing forward. The pilot aims by pointing the aircraft at the target, and the gun fires in the direction of flight. Simple, elegant, obvious, except for the propeller. Almost every aircraft of that era was a tractor configuration. The engine was at the front, and the propeller was at the nose, pulling the aircraft through the air. And the propeller was spinning at somewhere between 1,200 and 1,800 revolutions per minute. That is 20 to 30 complete revolutions every single second. Those blades are sweeping through the area directly in front of the gun muzzle with terrifying speed and regularity. You fire the gun, and the bullets will hit your own propeller. The blades will shatter. The engine will shake itself apart from the vibration. The aircraft will crash, and you will die, not at the hands of the enemy, but killed by your own weapon. So what are the alternatives? The early solutions are ingenious in their desperation. Some aircraft adopt a pusher configuration. The engine and propeller face backward, pushing rather than pulling the aircraft. This clears the front of the aircraft completely and allows a gunner to sit right in the nose with an unobstructed field of fire. The British F.E.2B is exactly this design. It works, but pusher aircraft have serious problems. They are generally slower, less maneuverable, and aerodynamically inferior to tractor designs. They are a compromise solution to a problem that demands something better. Another solution is to mount the gun on the upper wing, firing over the propeller arc. The Lewis gun mounted on the top wing of the Newport fighters is a perfect example. The gun fires above the propeller, and the bullets pass safely over the spinning blades. But this creates its own nightmares. The gun is above and behind the pilot, almost impossible to aim precisely, terrifying to reload. You have to stand up in the open cockpit at altitude, fighting hurricane-force winds to change the ammunition drum. And you cannot see where you're shooting worth a damn. Some desperate engineers try something truly audacious. They put steel deflector plates on the propeller blades. If a bullet hits a blade, the steel plate deflects it away rather than letting it shatter the wood. A French pilot named Roland Garros working with aircraft designer Raymond Saulnier, actually tests this system in the spring of 1915. And it works, after a fashion. Garreau scores several kills using his deflector plate-equipped Morane-Saulnier aircraft in April of 1915. He becomes, for a brief moment, the most feared pilot in the sky. The Germans cannot understand why he is so effective. They cannot figure out how he is doing it. Then, on April 19, 1915, Garreau is forced down behind German lines by ground fire. Not by another aircraft, by a lucky shot from a soldier on the ground. His aircraft is captured before he can destroy it. And the Germans take one look at those steel deflector plates on the propeller, and they understand immediately what he has been doing. And they know immediately that they need something better. Here is where the story takes a turn that reads like something from a Hollywood thriller. Because the man the Germans turn to for a solution is not a German at all. He is a Dutchman, a young, brilliant, almost preternaturally talented aircraft designer named Anthony Fokker. He is 25 years old. He has been building aircraft for barely 3 years. And he's about to change the entire course of aerial warfare. The German military shows Fokker the captured Garreau aircraft and gives him a simple directive. Solve this problem. Build us something better than deflector plates. You have 48 hours. What happens next is one of the most compressed and consequential bursts of engineering genius in military history. Fokker, drawing on an earlier concept that had been theorized but never successfully implemented, designs and builds a working mechanical interrupter gear in essentially 2 days. The concept is straightforward, but the execution is everything. You link the machine gun mechanically to the engine. You attach a cam, a specially shaped disc, to the propeller shaft. As the propeller rotates, the cam pushes a rod that momentarily prevents the gun from firing. The timing is precise. The gun can only fire when a gap between the propeller blades is in front of the muzzle. The moment a blade swings into the line of fire, the cam interrupts the trigger mechanism, and the gun falls silent for that fraction of a second. Then the blade passes and the gun fires again. It sounds simple. It is not simple. The engineering tolerances involved are extraordinary. The cam must be perfectly shaped to match the exact rotation speed of the propeller. The linkage mechanism must be reliable enough to function in Arctic cold and tropical heat after being soaked in engine oil and rattled by vibration for hours. The timing must be precise enough that at engine speeds that vary with throttle position, the gun never, not once, fires into its own propeller. And yet Fokker makes it work. He tests it himself, flying over the German lines and firing at targets on the ground, watching as the propeller blades sweep past while bullets stream forward through the gaps. He is, in that moment, piloting arguably the most dangerous weapon in the sky. The German military is ecstatic. They immediately equip a new aircraft, the Fokker Eindecker, a sleek monoplane design, with the synchronization gear and the forward-firing Spandau machine gun. And then they turn their pilots loose on the Allies. What follows is one of the most one-sided periods of aerial combat in history. The Allies have no equivalent technology. Their pilots are flying observation aircraft, pushers, aircraft with guns on the upper wing, none of which can match the pure, terrible effectiveness of a pilot who can simply point his aircraft at you and fire. The period from mid-1915 through early 1916 becomes known in British aviation circles as the Fokker Scourge. And Scourge is not an exaggeration. Allied aircraft are being shot down at terrifying rates. The Royal Flying Corps, the predecessor to the Royal Air Force, is losing crews faster than it could train them. There's a grim saying among RFC pilots during this period: you are lucky to last 3 weeks at the front. 3 weeks. These are young men, many of them barely 20 years old, with perhaps 20 hours of flight training, being sent to face Fokker Eindeckers with nothing but inadequate weapons and desperate courage. The Fokker pilots who master the new technology become legends. Max Immelmann, the Eagle of Lille, as the German press calls him, scores 15 victories before his death in June of 1916. He invents a maneuver still known today as the Immelmann turn: climb, roll over at the top, reverse direction, dive back into the fight from above. It is a signature move that becomes a fundamental building block of aerial combat tactics. Oswald Bolk, arguably the greatest tactical mind of early aviation, studies the Fokker and the synchronized gun and begins developing the first systematic rules of aerial combat. His dicta Bolk, his principles of dogfighting, are still taught in military aviation schools 100 years later. But the Allies are not standing still. They're scrambling desperately to understand what is happening to them and to find a solution. And here, the story becomes a tale of espionage and reverse engineering and the relentless pressure of war driving innovation at a pace that would have been impossible in peacetime. The breakthrough for the Allies comes from an unexpected direction. In April of 1916, almost exactly a year after Garros's forced landing gave the Germans their starting point, a German pilot makes a navigational error and lands his Fokker Eindecker at a British airfield. The aircraft, with its synchronization gear intact, falls into Allied hands. British engineers tear it apart with a focused intensity of people whose lives, and the lives of thousands of their countrymen, depend on understanding every single component of what they are looking at. What they find is elegant, infuriatingly, beautifully elegant. And within months, the British have their own interrupter gear, designed by engineers at Sopwith Aviation and refined by a Romanian-born inventor named George Constantinescu into what becomes known as the CC gear, the Constantinescu-Colley synchronization system. The French, working independently, develop their own version. And the technological advantage that the Germans have held for nearly a year begins to evaporate. Now both sides have synchronized guns. Now the sky becomes truly dangerous for everyone. And the nature of aerial combat begins to evolve rapidly, driven by technology on one side and tactics on the other, in a feedback loop that accelerates throughout 1916 and into 1917. Because once you have a synchronized gun, the aircraft becomes a weapons platform rather than just an observation tool. Suddenly, aircraft design is being driven by military requirements in a way it never had been before. You need speed to catch the enemy. You need maneuverability to get behind him. You need altitude to attack from above. You need structural strength to survive the violent maneuvers of combat. Everything about how aircraft are designed, built, and powered begins to change. The engines get more powerful. The known rotary engines of the early war give way to more powerful inline designs. Then to massive V8s and V12s producing hundreds of horsepower. The airframes get stronger. Steel tubing replaces wooden structures in critical areas. Multi-layer plywood replaces single-layer linen in some applications. The Camel, the SE.5, the Spad 13. These are not the fragile kites of 1914. They are genuine weapons systems designed from the ground up around the capability to carry guns and fight. And the pilots who fly them develop into something that has never existed before in human history. They become fighter pilots, not scouts, not observers, not aerial cavalry in some vague, poetic sense. Fighter pilots, men whose entire purpose, whose entire training, whose entire professional existence is devoted to the single task of finding enemy aircraft and destroying them. The culture that grows up around these men is extraordinary. On both sides of the conflict, the fighter pilots become celebrities. Their names appear in newspapers. Their photographs are published in magazines. In Germany, a system of awards is created specifically for aerial aces, pilots who have scored 10 or more victories. The poor Lummerite, better known as the Blue Max, becomes the most coveted decoration in the German military, and it is dominated by fighter pilots. In France and Britain, the press cannot get enough of the aviators. Albert Ball, a quiet, almost shy young man from Nottingham, becomes one of the first great British aces, scoring 44 victories before his death in May of 1917 at the age of 20. James McCudden, the son of an Army sergeant major, rises from mechanic to become one of the most effective fighter pilots of the war. Billy Bishop, a Canadian, shoots down 72 enemy aircraft and becomes one of the most decorated soldiers in the British Empire. Mick Mannock, arguably the greatest British pilot of the war, scores 61 victories despite having been nearly blind in one eye since childhood. But above all of them, above every pilot on every side in the First World War, stands one figure, one name that has become inseparable from the very concept of aerial warfare. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Richthofen does not discover aerial combat. He does not invent the synchronized gun or the interrupter gear or any of the technology that makes fighter aviation possible. What he does is take all of that technology and combine it with a methodical, almost scientific approach to aerial combat that makes him more effective than anyone who has ever climbed into a cockpit. He scores his first aerial victory in September of 1916. By the end of that year, he has 16. By April of 1917, a month so catastrophic for the Royal Flying Corps that it becomes known simply as Bloody April, he is scoring victories at a rate that defies comprehension. In Bloody April alone, the RFC loses 245 aircraft and 211 aircrew killed or missing. Richthofen personally accounts for 21 of those victories in that single month. He paints his aircraft red, not out of vanity or not entirely out of vanity, but as a deliberate psychological tactic. He wants enemy pilots to know who is coming for them. He wants them to feel that specific fear of knowing it is him. He wants the red aircraft to mean something in the sky, and it does. Allied pilots who spot a red triplane above them know, with cold certainty, that they are in the most dangerous situation of their lives. He commands a fighter wing, Jageschwader I, which the Allies nicknamed the Flying Circus because of its brightly painted aircraft, and he trains his pilots with a rigor and attention to tactical detail that elevates the entire unit. The Flying Circus is not just a collection of good pilots. It is a machine designed and run by Richthofen, optimized for one purpose, aerial destruction. And underlying all of it, making all of it possible, is the synchronized gun. The Spandau machine guns mounted in the nose of his Fokker Dr. I triplane, timed to the fraction of a second, firing 600 rounds per minute through a gap that exists for mere milliseconds as the propeller blades sweep past. Without that technology, Richthofen is just a cavalry officer who learned to fly. With it, he becomes the deadliest pilot in the history of aviation up to that point, scoring 80 confirmed aerial victories before his death in April of 1918. Richthofen's death is, fittingly, as contested and mysterious as his legend. He is killed on April 21st, 1918, during a low-level pursuit over the Somme. The official Allied credit goes to Canadian pilot Roy Brown. But the wound that kills Richthofen, a single bullet that enters from the right side and exits from the left, is more consistent with ground fire than with the angle of Brown's attack. The Australian troops on the ground who see Richthofen's Fokker come in for its final landing claim that their anti-aircraft gunners scored the fatal hit. The debate continues to this day, more than 100 years later, and historians still argue passionately about who actually killed the Red Baron. What is not in dispute is what he left behind. By the time of his death, the entire architecture of modern fighter aviation, the tactics, the doctrine, the concept of the fighter ace, the institutional culture of air forces, have been built on the foundation of technologies like the synchronized gun. The war that Richthofen fought was utterly different from the war that had begun in 1914, and the synchronized gun was one of the primary reasons why. But the story does not end with the First World War. Because the lesson that every military power in the world took from 1914 to 1918 was that air power was not a sideshow. Air power was not a supporting arm. Air power was potentially decisive. And in the years between the wars, every major nation began building air forces that were designed from the very first principles around the fighter aircraft and its gun. The technology of the interrupter gear continues to evolve through the 1920s and 1930s. The mechanical systems become more reliable, more precisely calibrated, capable of functioning at higher engine speeds and higher rates of fire. The aircraft, they are fitted to become faster, more powerful, more capable in every respect. By the mid-1930s, the gap between a First World War fighter and a modern fighter is enormous. What had been 100 miles per hour is now 300. What had been 150 horsepower is now 1,000. What had been 1 or 2 machine guns is now 4, 6, or 8. When the Second World War begins in September of 1939, the fighter aircraft is a mature weapons system in a way that it simply was not in 1914. The Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Mitsubishi Zero, these are not experiments. They are refined, purpose-built machines that represent decades of accumulated knowledge about what a fighter needs to be. And the synchronized gun is still there. In the Bf 109, 2 synchronized machine guns fire through the propeller arc, a direct technological descendant of the Fokker-Eindecker's single-span Dow. The Spitfire uses a different approach. Its 8.30 3 machine guns are mounted in the wings, outside the propeller arc entirely, so no synchronization is needed. But the design choice itself reflects a century of hard-won knowledge about the relationship between guns and propellers. The Battle of Britain in 1940 is, in many ways, the culmination of everything that the synchronized gun had set in motion a quarter century earlier. 2 highly sophisticated air forces, both built on the doctrine of the fighter ace and the dogfight and the forward-firing gun, clash in the skies over southern England in one of the most consequential aerial battles in history. The pilots on both sides are the heirs of Richthofen and Ball in bulk, not just in a poetic sense, but in a direct, traceable lineage of tactics and doctrine that runs continuously from 1915 to 1940. And in that battle, the synchronized gun reaches something close to its final form. The Bf 109 that Luftwaffe pilots fly over England in the summer of 1940 is armed with 2 synchronized machine guns firing through the propeller and 2 20mm cannons in the wings. The combination gives it firepower that no First World War pilot could have imagined. The synchronization gear that coordinates those nose-mounted guns is a refined, thoroughly tested, highly reliable mechanism that reflects nearly 30 years of continuous development. But technology never stands still. And even as the Second World War reaches its peak intensity, the synchronized gun, that brilliant, essential life-and-death mechanism, is beginning to be made obsolete by something that nobody in 1915 could have imagined: the jet engine. The jet aircraft has no propeller. It has no rotating blades in front of the gun. It has no synchronization problem. When the Messerschmitt Me 262 enters service in 1944, armed with 4 30mm cannons, in its nose firing without any synchronization gear needed, it represents a fundamental shift in how aerial combat works. You aim the aircraft at the enemy and you fire. The propeller is gone. The problem that Anthony Fokker solved in 48 hours in 1915, the problem that had shaped the development of aviation for 3 decades, simply ceases to exist. The jet age does not arrive immediately, of course. Propeller aircraft fight on through 1945 and beyond. The P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest piston engine fighter ever built, uses wing-mounted guns that avoid the synchronization problem entirely, while remaining a decisive weapons platform against Luftwaffe fighters and bombers over the skies of occupied Europe. The Spitfire continues to evolve through the end of the war and into the 1950s. Its powerful Merlin and Griffin engines driving propellers that still need synchronized or wing-mounted guns to be effective. But the future belongs to the jets. And with the jets, the specific technological challenge that the synchronized gun was designed to solve disappears. The problem is solved not by a better interrupter gear, but by eliminating the thing that the interrupter gear was designed to work around. It is worth pausing here to think about what this story actually means. What it tells us about technology and war and human ingenuity under pressure. The synchronized gun did not exist before 1915. There was no interrupter gear. There was no solution to the propeller problem. And yet, within a matter of months, driven by the absolute life-or-death urgency of a world war, the solution was found, tested, deployed, refined, improved, and distributed to thousands of aircraft on both sides of the conflict. The speed of that development is breathtaking even by modern standards. By the standards of 1915, it is almost miraculous. And that speed was driven by fear, by the knowledge that if you did not solve this problem, the other side would, and then they would have an advantage that would cost lives on a massive scale. In the industrial killing ground of the Western Front, where hundreds of thousands of men were dying in the trenches, the aerial war above was in some ways a parallel universe. Intimate, individual, almost medieval in its emphasis on personal skill and courage. But the technology driving that aerial war was utterly modern, utterly 20th century, utterly driven by the same industrial logic that was grinding the armies below into the mud. The pilots who flew those early synchronized gun aircraft on both sides were risking their lives not just against enemy aircraft, but against the technology itself. The early interrupter gears were not perfectly reliable. There are documented cases of the mechanism failing, the gun firing at the wrong moment, bullets shattering propeller blades, aircraft going down not because of the enemy, but because their own gun killed them. The men who first tested these systems were essentially human crash test dummies, flying experimental weapons that might work perfectly or might kill them without warning. That they flew anyway, that they strapped into those cockpits knowing the risks and flew, tells you something fundamental about the nature of military aviation and the character of the people it attracted. There is another dimension to this story that deserves attention. The ethics and aesthetics of aerial combat, particularly in the First World War, were shaped profoundly by the technology of the synchronized gun. The gun transformed the fighter pilot from a scout into a hunter, from an observer into a killer. And the culture of chivalry that grew up around fighter aviation, the saluting of fallen enemies, the dropping of flowers over opposing airfields, the honoring of aces on both sides, was in part a response to the psychological weight of that killing. These were young men who had been trained to chase down other human beings and shoot them out of the sky, who looked through their gun sights at another aircraft and saw, if they were close enough, a man in that cockpit, a man not so different from themselves, wearing similar clothes, flying a similar machine, afraid of the same things. The chivalry was not just posturing. It was a way of processing the reality of what the synchronized gun made possible. It was a way of maintaining humanity in the face of a technology designed to destroy it. The story of the synchronized gun is also, at a deeper level, a story about the relationship between individual genius and institutional need. Fokker did not invent the concept of the interrupter gear. The idea had been theorized before he implemented it. But he was the one who took a theoretical concept and turned it into a working, deployable weapons system in a time frame that defied belief. He succeeded not just because he was brilliant, though he clearly was, but because he had immediate, concrete, life-or-death feedback telling him whether his solution worked or not. War is a brutal accelerant of technology precisely because the stakes are so absolute. And then there's the broader question of what the synchronized gun ultimately achieved. Did it win the war? Did it save lives in the long run by shortening the conflict? Or did it simply add a new dimension of death to an already catastrophic conflict, training a generation of young men to see the sky as a killing ground and establishing templates for aerial warfare that would be used to devastating effect in 1939, 1940, 1941, and beyond? These are not simple questions. They do not have simple answers. Technology in war is never neutral. The synchronized gun killed specific people. Name people. Pilots whose files you can still find in the archives of national militaries, whose photographs still exist, who had parents and siblings and sweethearts and futures that the interrupter gear helped to cut short. But the same technology also drove the development of aviation in ways that ultimately benefited humanity enormously. The engines developed for fighter aircraft found their way into civil aviation. The aerodynamic knowledge gained from designing fighters shaped the aircraft that would eventually carry civilians across oceans. The manufacturing techniques developed to produce synchronized guns and their mechanisms fed into industrial processes that had nothing to do with war. Technology, even military technology, does not stay in its lane. The Second World War makes this point with brutal clarity. The synchronized gun is, by 1939, mature enough that its further development offers only incremental gains. The big leaps, the decisive technological innovations of that conflict, come from other directions. Radar, jet propulsion, long-range navigation systems, the proximity fuse, nuclear weapons. Each of these changes the character of warfare in ways that the synchronized gun could not have anticipated and the pilots who flew behind it could not have imagined. And yet the synchronized gun is there at the beginning of all of it. It is the reason why air forces exist as independent services. It is the reason why fighter pilots are trained the way they are trained. It is the reason why the culture of aviation, the swagger, the independence, the emphasis on individual skill, is what it is. You cannot understand the Spitfire without understanding the Eindecker. You cannot understand the Battle of Britain without understanding the Fokker Scourge. You cannot understand modern air power without going back to that extraordinary moment in 1915 when a 25-year-old Dutchman sat down and solved one of the hardest engineering problems in military aviation history in 48 hours. The synchronized gun matters not just as a piece of military technology. It matters as a symbol of what human beings are capable of when the pressure is absolute and the stakes could not be higher. It represents a moment when the gap between an idea and its implementation was compressed to almost nothing. When theory became practice, became weapon, became history in a matter of weeks. Today, if you visit the RAF Museum in London, or the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, or the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace outside Paris, you can stand in front of the actual aircraft that flew with these synchronized guns. You can look at the Fokker Doctor, a triplane, and see the twin Spandau guns mounted in front of the cockpit, their muzzles pointing forward, the propeller blade still in front of them after all these years. You can look at the Sopwith Camel, with its twin Vickers guns mounted above the nose, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. You can put yourself in the place of the pilot who sat behind those guns and try to imagine what it felt like to fly into combat, trusting a mechanical cam and a connecting rod to save your propeller blades and your life thousands of times per minute. Those pilots trusted that mechanism with everything they had. They had to. There was no alternative. You flew with the technology you had, and you trusted it. And sometimes it failed and people died, and sometimes it worked perfectly and people still died, because war is not fair and technology does not promise survival. It only changes the odds. The odds it changed, in the case of the synchronized gun, were enormous. From a spring of 1915, when Fokker's Eindecker first took to the sky with a gun that could fire through its own propeller, to the summer of 1945, when the last great propeller-driven air battles of the Second World War were winding down, the The synchronized gun was one of the defining technologies of aerial combat. For 30 years, it sat at the center of how nations fought for control of the sky. For 30 years, it was the mechanism that made the fighter pilot possible, that turned a brave man in an airplane from an observer into a lethal weapon system. And then, with the quiet revolution of the jet engine, it became a historical artifact, a brilliant solution to a problem that no longer existed. A technological masterpiece preserved in museums, studied by historians, and remembered by the dwindling number of people who understand what it meant to fly in an age when your own propeller was potentially your deadliest enemy. The men who flew behind those guns, Immelman, Bolk, Richthofen, Ball, McCudden, Manick, Bishop, Fonck, Geinmer, Luke Rickenbacker, are remembered today as legends, as heroes, as the first generation of a new kind of warrior. Their names are attached to airfields and squadrons and awards. Their photographs hang in the halls of air forces around the world. Their tactics are still taught, in modified form, in the classrooms of fighter weapons schools. But none of what they achieved would have been possible without that mechanism. Without that cam on the propeller shaft, and that rod connecting it to the trigger, and that precisely calibrated timing that allowed a gun to fire hundreds of times per minute through a gap that existed for only milliseconds. Without the synchronized gun, there are no aces. Without the synchronized gun, there are no dogfights in the way we understand them. Without the synchronized gun, the entire culture and doctrine and institutional identity of fighter aviation does not exist. That is the legacy of a piece of engineering that most people have never heard of. That is the weight of history carried by a mechanism that fits in a shoebox and changed the world. The synchronized gun, the device that let you shoot through your own propeller, the invention that gave birth to the fighter pilot, the technology that shaped the sky for 30 years and whose influence in doctrine and culture and institutional identity has never entirely gone away. It is, when you think about it, one of the most important pieces of military technology ever devised. Not because it was the most powerful. It was just a gun, after all, attached to a propeller by a rod and a cam. But because of what it enabled, because of what became possible once it existed, because of how completely it changed the nature of war in the air. Anthony Fokker built it in 48 hours. The world has been living with the consequences ever since. And the next time you look up at a sky full of aircraft, civilian or military, jet or propeller, remember that the entire concept of what it means to control the air, to fight for the sky, to use aviation as a weapon of war, was born in those 48 hours. Was born from that one problem. Was born from the question that haunted every engineer and every pilot in the earliest days of aerial warfare. How do you shoot a gun through your own propeller? Now you know the answer, and now you know why that answer changed everything.